Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Daniel Craig puts on the tux for one final time in his last outing as James Bond, No Time to Die. Following the events of Spectre, James Bond, played by Daniel Craig, is in Italy with his new love, Madeleine Swann, played by Seydoux, but their honeymoon is shattered when they are attacked by assassins working for the captured Blofeld, played by Christoph Waltz, and Bond believes that Madeleine betrayed him. 5 years later, after Project Heracles, a nanobot weapon approved by M, played by Ralph Fiennes, is stolen from an MI6 lab. A retired Bond is asked by Felix Leiter, played by Jeffrey Wright, to help the CIA recover it, working against MI6's new 007 Naomie, played by Lashana Lynch. Bond's mission eventually returns him to MI6, where he will have to confront the past once and for all, including a new enemy from Swann's past, Safin, played by Rami Malek, who has devastating plans for Project Heracles. Well, it's finally here at long last. James Bond is back. 6 years after Spectre, the longest gap between Bond movies since License to Kill and GoldenEye, No Time to Die at last arrives on the big screen after a fairly tumultuous production process, to say the least, including the fact that director Danny Boyle was replaced over creative differences with Kari Goji Fukunaga, best known for co-writing the screenplay for It, as well as helming True Detective and Beasts of No Nation, and then of course Daniel Craig injured himself again during the film's production, but that was nothing compared to the release date postponements, because No Time to Die effectively became the poster boy for release date bumps due to COVID-19. It was the first major movie to really push itself out of the way of the pandemic, and that pretty much signalled that things weren't going to be normal from that point forward. Originally scheduled for April 2020, it of course moved to November 2020, and now finally we're getting to see it in September of 2021. So effectively, because we knew this was going to be Daniel Craig's final outing as James Bond, it's turned the movie into a very long, almost roadshow farewell, and it almost seems weird that it has actually finally released, because I'm so used to it just being bumped to later in the year at some point, but now we have it. So the question on everyone's lips is this a fitting final outing for Daniel Craig, especially given that Spectre had a very divisive reception? And I believe that the answer is yes. Yes, it is. I make no secret of the fact that I'm a big fan of Daniel Craig's interpretation of the character. He was the right person at the right time for Bond. What was supposed to be the big 20th film celebration, Die Another Day, instead revealed itself to be a ridiculous embarrassment that was almost absurdly out of touch and impossible to take seriously. Bond needed a refresh, and Craig provided that, and that did scare a lot of the series traditionalists who protested his casting purely on the basis of his hair colour, but the fact that he is different is the reason why he's worked so well in the past. Craig is cut from a noticeably rougher cloth, and that makes him much more plausible in the action sequences. This is a Bond that is very much a soldier carrying out assignments, and so he's very brute force. He is a weapon. You see this right from the very first time we see him in that bathroom brawl at the start of Casino Royale that pretty much set the tone for all the action sequences to follow in Craig's films. But what Casino Royale also did is that it stripped away a lot of the gimmickry around the character, the gadgets and the gizmos, and a lot of the sort of traditional Bond traits, and instead placed the focus on Bond as a human, as a person, as a character, and I think that is what Craig has done so well. He feels like the most fully rounded, developed version of Bond as we've ever seen him on screen, that feels very faithful in spirit to Ian Fleming's writing, at least in my opinion. But what I also find so fascinating about Craig is that the way that he portrays Bond as being this very conflicted figure, because on the one hand, he does try very hard to be cold, clinical, and detached, but he has got those emotions bubbling under the surface that give him away, and Craig's subtle expressiveness, especially in those piercing blue eyes, is what made him so endlessly compelling in the part. Craig has the charm, he has the wit, he has the charisma, but he also feels like he could be genuinely deadly. So Craig has been fantastic throughout this entire 5-film run, even if the movies themselves have been a very rocky road. And while I think that a lot of Bonds changed the role over their tenure, I don't think the franchise has ever changed so dramatically as it has done under Craig. He was a Bond that was so human and also so vulnerable. He could be hurt in more ways than the obvious. They couldn't just reset the character at the end of Casino Royale, and they've continued that storyline throughout his films, and that is a significant difference from all the Bonds that came before, in that previously, yes, you had recurring elements, yes, they did occasionally bring up Tracy from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but generally speaking, the Bond films operated onto themselves. You could watch them out of sequence and it wouldn't matter a jot, whereas Craig's films do have an overarching storyline, and to some extent that is a concession to just modern filmmaking these days, where everything has to be shared universes and continuing storylines. But even so, I think that this worked for this iteration of the character, because again, you couldn't just wipe away everything that Bond had gone through in Casino Royale, and I think that because they made them sequels directly, that allowed them to actually add more depth onto the character and more nuance, and play around with the fact that he is someone carrying around the scars, both literal and figurative, of all the adventures that he's gone through along the way. So I think that that has rejuvenated the franchise. It has made things feel fresh again because they are taking those chances. However, Spectre definitely shows the pitfalls of that sort of thing, in that there were several significant developments that again teetered the series very close into just pure parody. So No Time to Die has to operate as a lot of things simultaneously. It has to be a sequel to Spectre whilst also being a course correction and also being a farewell to Daniel Craig as James Bond. And I feel like that in and of itself is very different for the franchise, because a lot of his Bond predecessors, either they didn't know that their final films were going to be their last one, in the case of Dawson or Brosnan, or they stuck around in the role too long like Moore did, and their final films weren't much of a last hurrah. That's definitely not the case here. It feels like a concerted effort was made to try and bring back all of the major storylines from Craig's films in one way or another and try to tie everything up. And I feel like as an audience member, and I'd imagine for Craig himself, that provides a necessary amount of closure. And you have to remember, at this point, Craig has been playing the role for 15 years. That is the longest run that anyone has had as James Bond. Yeah, he had a 2-year boost because of the pandemic, and even though he hasn't made the most Bond films, that still goes to Connery and Moore, I feel like he's defined what that character is to a whole generation of moviegoers. He has left an indelible mark on the franchise. I feel like it's very satisfying because it provides that necessary closing of the book on this particular era for the character. So because of those aims, No Time to Die's script is messy, to say the least, although to more accurately describe it, it's gargantuan and unwieldy. At 162 minutes, No Time to Die is far and away the longest Bond movie to date, and it's a full-fledged Bond banquet. Everything that you could probably want in a Bond movie is in here somewhere, and I genuinely can't think of what I'd cut, even though I also admit that it's overstuffed and definitely overlong. It does feel like the movie at certain points shows the sort of real scars of its production process, because it feels like two movies kind of fighting against each other and then merged into this huge amorphous blob, but in the moment, it works from scene to scene. It's enjoyable. It's only later when you think back upon the movie you realise, like, oh, there is so much going on in this movie, and it doesn't entirely hold together when you think about it closely, because Craig works as Bond, and because Bond's emotional arc in this movie lands properly. The fact that plotting is more ridiculously contorted than a Cirque du Soleil act, I don't think that really matters in the grand scheme of things, because it works in the places that it's supposed to. However, I will admit that this is a movie that tries to do everything and bring everyone back. Everyone that's still around in this franchise comes back here. Leiter's back, M's back, Moneypenny's back, Q, all of them are back. And I think that the movie definitely buckles to a certain extent under the strain of that, because so many characters are here because they have to be, because it's the final hurrah, but also it doesn't really give them enough to do. I feel like a good example of this is actually Ralph Fiennes as M here, in that Fiennes is playing the character with a darker edge than usual than we previously saw him in Spectre and Skyfall, because he's directly connected to the weapon that ends up being stolen here. So he is at least partially responsible for what happens in the plot of the movie, and I feel like for the first half of it, it's kind of leading to somewhere where M has his judgment questioned and maybe challenged somewhat, or that we see this very kind of brutal side to him that we hadn't really thought about previously. And I feel like in the second half of the movie, they largely forget about that, especially because Fiennes towards the end of the film is pretty much just sitting around watching Bond on a monitor. And that's true for a lot of characters, actually. And I felt genuinely sorry for Naomie Harris, because I know that Moneypenny has been traditionally a fairly thankless role, but in previous films, they did make an effort to try and make it a more proactive character, whereas here, she genuinely is just around because it's the last movie. And again, she's just sat around in the background of scenes of Fiennes' M watching screens. I also feel like, to a certain extent, Moneypenny is a character that has been harmed by the fact they've introduced this new agent of Naomie, who I feel like in some attributes is a little bit too similar to the rebooted version of Moneypenny. So you've definitely got that kind of crossover there that meant they didn't really know what to do with Moneypenny as a character in this installment. It's always nice to see Ben Whishaw back as Q, though. Again, I like his interpretation of the character. It's nicely reverential to Desmond Llewellyn, whilst also feeling very fresh and unique and different. I also think that Whishaw actually gets some of the best lines here. You can definitely tell that Phoebe Waller-Bridge has done some of the rewrites on the script. There is a little twinkle to the dialogue. It's nice to see Jeffrey Wright back as Felix Leiter. We haven't seen him in the Craig films for a very long time, since Quantum of Solace, in fact, so it's a welcome return. And I feel like, even though Leiter hasn't received a whole bunch of screen time, even going all the way back to Casino Royale, you could definitely feel in Craig and Wright's performances that they had a genuine friendship and kinship, even though they're spies for two different agencies. There is this kind of mutual respect between them. So it's nice to get a few extra scenes with Leiter, even if he is perennially underused, because he's Felix Leiter in a James Bond film. Léa Seydoux, I still feel very mixed about Madeleine as a character, and I feel like that goes back to the fact that I had problems with her in Spectre, because I never really believed the ending of that movie, that Bond would throw everything away for her. The character's meant to be Vesper 2.0, and it just feels like Seydoux doesn't quite have the same level of impact that Eva Green brought to the character. I feel like it says something about how significant Green was in that movie that we're still talking about her 5 movies later. And Seydoux, I feel like, is kind of stuck here in the role of really being someone for Bond to rescue a lot of the time, particularly in the early section of the film and then later on when she's reintroduced. And I don't think it helps that she disappears out of a good hour of the movie. So I feel like as a character, Madeleine still doesn't have the right level of impact for me to totally buy the relationship that Craig's Bond has with her. I do feel like the movie also undersells some of its new cast, in particular Ana de Armas, who was very much hyped being in this movie, especially because she shared the screen with Craig in Knives Out, and she joins him for one sequence in the movie in Cuba, and I really liked her character. I think that she is a highlight in the movie. She definitely has this kind of lightness of touch, playing this rookie character that genuinely plays really well, and I look forward to seeing her in future installments. They leave that character open in case they want to bring her back. I think that would be a wise decision, because even though she's only in the movie for maybe 10-15 minutes, I genuinely wanted to see more of her. However, I did like Lashana Lynch as Naomie, the new 007, who definitely adds a welcome friction to Craig's Bond. She's this young, cocky upstart. She knows that she's taken his place, taken his mantle, and proudly taunts him about it because she knows that gets under his skin. And I really like the competitive nature of their relationship. There's a kind of spikiness to their interactions, especially in the first half of the movie, and particularly in the big action set piece in Cuba, where they're each trying to steal out the target from each other, and it's in this way where they're each trying to prove that they're better than one another. I really liked that. That's kind of character going into the action sequences, and Lynch definitely steals some scenes in the film, especially because the character occasionally lets her arrogance get the best of her, but also once the characters inevitably work together towards the ending of the movie, there's still that kind of electricity to their dynamic. Craig and Lynch work well together. Lynch is slightly let down by the fact that, again, the character gets sidelined through the middle hour of the movie. I feel like the character, they didn't know how to really work with her in the middle of the film. They knew how to start with that character and they knew how to end with that character, but they didn't know what to do in the middle, and it shows a little bit. And I think that hurts Lynch because she's such a standout character, and then she kind of drops out of the movie for a little bit. But overall, I think that she quite impresses here. Unfortunately, it's not all good news for the newcomers. Rami Malek is a big disappointment as Safin, but I don't think it's entirely his fault. I think the movie has a villain problem. It tries to have two villains, and it just ends up detracting from them both. And I feel like, again, that's because this is very much a movie of two halves, or if you would like, two flicks smushed together. And so the first half is very much Blofeld, 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 Spectre, because it's continuing on from that thread. And while Waltz isn't in a whole bunch of this movie, in fact, a lot of his appearances are in fleeting surveillance camera footage or in voiceover, Blofeld is a big presence in the early portion of the movie, and then he gets one major scene with Bond, and it is really well acted. I like the dynamic that Craig and Waltz bring to that scene. Waltz can practically play villainy in his sleep, but it feels like a waste of the character because that's not where the story is heading. And as such, it feels like an unnecessary distraction that takes away focus from the real villain of the movie in Safin, who, aside from the pre-title sequence, the double pre-title sequence, again showing how overstuffed this is, doesn't actually appear in the movie until the second half of it. And the first bit that we see in the opening title sequence doesn't really give us very much of a sense of his character. And even later on, it feels like he's mysterious to a fault. He's not in the movie a whole lot. And so we never fully understand why he's doing what he's doing. There is a revenge motive that is recognisable enough. But if you were to ask an audience member, why is he doing his plot at the end of the movie? I think they genuinely wouldn't be able to tell you, because it doesn't make sense with his motivations. It really feels like it comes out of left field because they need a bad guy. And while Malek is creepy and unsettling, he doesn't dominate the screen in the same way that, say, Javier Bardem did in Skyfall. So you end up left with a fairly lackluster villain who's a question mark even at the end of the movie. And I think that Malek does try his hardest here, but the script fails him. As you would expect for a Bond movie, there are some terrific action set pieces, particularly the pre-title in Italy and that lengthy protracted chase where Craig's Bond jumps off of a bridge, he rides around on a motorcycle and jumps into the air, and he rides around in the Aston Martin DB5, and that goes on for at least 15 to 20 minutes. But it feels completely intense the whole time. It manages to keep that tension, which is quite a feat, because something that long can normally feel fatiguing, but actually the movie sets a bar fairly early that it struggles to top for the remaining rest of its running time, and that's not for a lack of effort. I think there are some great little skirmishes all throughout. The fight scene in Cuba that I already mentioned. Armas definitely throws herself into the choreography there, again proving why they should bring that character back, and the way that Bond and Naomie compete against each other there. I feel like there's a lot of very intricate things going on in that particular set piece. I feel like, though, the movie flags a little bit in the middle, because that's where a lot of the plot starts to come into play, and because of that, there is what I feel to be a gap between action set pieces, where once we leave Cuba, we don't really get a big full-fledged action sequence until we go to Norway, where we have that big forest car chase. That action set piece doesn't quite land in the way that it really should do. There are some impressive stunts, but it doesn't feel as exciting as it should. But the movie manages to pick back up in its final stretch when Bond and Naomie go to Saffin's Island, where it pretty much becomes a non-stop parade of gunfights and fisticuffs from that point forward, which are as brutal and as personalised as we've ever seen in a Bond movie. There's some quite satisfyingly crunchy action, particularly in one standout set piece where Bond has to work his way up a stairwell, which is in a continuous shot, against a group of henchmen that are throwing grenades at him. The last act of this movie is particularly explodey, and it feels like Bond has to exert every last drop of effort just to work his way upwards and take out these bad guys one by one. And because the shot is unbroken, you feel just as tired as Bond is by the end of it. It's definitely a sequence that owes a big debt to the John Wick franchise, and it ends in a gotcha that definitely would be right at home in that particular series. It's a moment that made me go, "Oh!" right there in the cinema. But in my mind, it also felt like a natural bookend to that bathroom fight in Casino Royale, the first time we saw Craig's Bond. It feels like it's just as rough as that sequence, and I feel like it was designed to echo it in some way. And watching this movie, yes, it is bloated, yes, it is overlong, but I was also never not entertained, and I genuinely thought to myself as I was watching it, I've really missed this kind of fun, enjoyable, big budget extravaganza. So yeah, I like No Time to Die a lot, in spite of its faults. I feel like Craig is leaving the character in a better place than how he found him. You look at previous Bonds and their final films, like Diamonds Are Forever, A View to a Kill, or Die Another Day, and they feel unbecoming of those Bonds, whereas here, it lives up to what Craig has brought to the character. He has given everything to him and nothing less, and I feel like he's made a real lasting impact on the character, I hope, even going forward. The movies are going to be different again from this point forward. The Bond movies are always going to evolve because that's what they do, but boy, that is going to be one big tuxedo to fill. In the meantime, though, au revoir, Daniel. You did it proud. If you like this review, then you can buy me a Ko-fi, or you can get top secret access over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.